E3 used to be the premier gaming event of the year, but as the industry landscape started to change, E3 couldn't keep up. After several years of cancelled events, E3 was clearly hanging on by a thread. That's why it wasn't all too surprising when the entertainment software organization officially announced E3 was gone for good on December 12th, 2023. It's a sad end to what was one of my absolute favorite times of the year. I feel like there's been some misconceptions about what really led to E3's demise, so let's take a look at E3's history to see where it all went wrong. In the early 90s, the premier electronics showcase was the Consumer Electronics Show, better known as CES. That event was great for showing off new computers and television, stuff like that, but they weren't giving the same attention and respect to video games. At the time, video games weren't as accepted as they are now, and CES was a good representation of this. Video games seemed to be an afterthought at this showcase, being regulated to the worst parts of the show floor. Developers were fed up by the poor conditions and treatment they were receiving from CES and wanted an alternative. So in came Pat Farrell, who is considered to be the founder of E3. Pat saw the way the gaming industry was growing and knew it deserved better than what CES was giving them. So he started getting the word out there that he wanted to make an alternative. He was able to reach an agreement with Doug Lowenstein, the leader of the Video Game Association. Together they got to work on their new Electronic Entertainment Expo. The first E3 was held in May 1995, and despite being a brand new event, they were able to get all of the big companies to join in. Developers were thrilled to have an alternative to CES. As it turned out, 1995 was a great year to have the first E3, as there were some huge announcements. Sony unveiled the original PlayStation for the very first time, and Sega also showed off their new console, the Sega Saturn. It goes without saying that these were huge announcements that garnered a lot of press and attention for the first E3, but I also want to note I feel these two consoles gave us the first instance of what eventually would make E3 so impactful. Sega had announced that the Saturn would cost $399, and at the very same E3, Sony unveiled that the PlayStation would cost just $299. Having this moment of one-upping a competitor was huge for Sony. They were the newcomers to the console space and were able to outdo the industry veteran Sega. This instance of trying to one-up the competitor would become a staple for E3 and became a big part of the show's identity in the eyes of the fans. Keep that idea of competition in mind, as this is going to be extremely important to our story. E3 was so successful in its first year that CES was forced to cancel one of their yearly events. As a result of E3, CES was never able to go back to their previous twice-a-year schedule, although CES does continue to be held once a year to this day. Over the next 10 years, E3's growth continued to skyrocket. With every passing year, it was becoming more and more extravagant, and it was without a doubt the premier gaming showcase in the world. However, there was one thing missing, and that was fan interaction. E3 was primarily meant for industry insiders and reporters, and this held true throughout its life. Fans could really only get in if they had a connection or won some kind of contest. The only way fans could really engage with the showcase was through reading what reporters said happened, but that changed in 2005. Beginning in 2005, E3 was going to be aired live to the public for the first time. The television channel G4 would air the conferences and have nearly 24-hour coverage of everything E3. This television broadcast in 2005 was the first time that E3 became the spectacle we knew throughout the 2010s. The intricate E3 press conferences that we're all familiar with did not used to be the norm. Early E3 press conferences were dull and boring. As I mentioned previously, it was only meant for industry professionals. It would primarily just be someone standing in front of a podium talking to the group. It would be the job of the journalist to spice things up when reporting for the fans. But thanks to G4, the fans could now watch the press conferences live, and with that meant the fans wanted to be entertained. That is what caused the evolution into the E3 press conferences that we all fell in love with. I was very young at the time, so I'm not sure what year I first watched E3, but I know it was one of the years when they had it on G4, and I was absolutely enamored by it. The next several years after 2005 saw the rise of the internet, with E3 beginning to be streamed live there as well as on television. The move to have the event covered live across TV and the internet helped fans get extremely invested in E3, and the growth was just getting started. The 2010s was absolutely the golden age of E3. With internet live streaming becoming more established, E3 press conferences were getting more viewers than ever before. With that came even more growth and even more flair. So far, we've just done a lot of talking about E3's history up until this point. So now let's talk about why I personally loved E3 so much. There was something so incredibly special about the week of E3. Obviously, it was a time where we got tons of new game and console announcements, which was extremely exciting. But it was more than that. It felt like a celebration of gaming, a mark of where we were as an industry. It felt like a time when the whole community could really come together. Like I said before, I was obsessed with E3. I remember telling my mom about what days and times there would be press conferences just to make sure nothing got scheduled that would make me miss them. I would watch every conference no matter what, even the ones I didn't really care about. I would watch every Xbox conference despite never owning an Xbox console. I would watch every EA conference despite always hating it. I would suffer through every Ubisoft Just Dance flash mob purely because it was E3 and it was tradition. And it's funny because I remember all the comments would always talk about how bad EA or Ubisoft conferences were, but we all watched them anyway because it was just such a big moment for the community. I also think E3 conferences really helped to humanize the gaming industry. It put faces to the games that we play, and we got to see great looks into the personalities of these individuals. Miyamoto, Satoru Iwata, Mark Cerny, Reggie, Phil Spencer, all of these people who we used to see constantly at these conferences became fixtures in gaming culture. For Nintendo specifically, I don't think it's a coincidence that Satoru Iwata and Reggie are remembered so fondly, because they were the tops of the company during E3's golden age. Meanwhile, the new leaders of Nintendo have struggled to engage the fans in the same way. It was great to see the passion developers had for their games as they would present them to us, and hearing the crowd go crazy for certain announcements is something that just can't quite be matched anymore. Another element that did certainly play into E3's popularity was the mistakes that would happen. Every year there would be something that went wrong. The examples that come to my mind would be when the Skyward Sword demo had failed motion controls, when Jesse's teleprompter didn't work when talking about Need for Speed, and when the Uncharted 4 demo froze. These mistakes were often the most viewed and most talked about moments from every E3. Of course, these types of errors are not good for the companies, but fans gravitated towards them and was a big reason why E3 became so iconic. E3 was not just something that fans liked watching for fun, it was extremely important for these gaming companies. Entire console generations could live or die based on their showings at E3. No company represents that better than Sony. PlayStation's entire history of dominance can be heavily attributed to E3. I mentioned earlier how they were able to one-up Sega at E3 1995 with their low price of the PlayStation 1. Meanwhile, Sony's lowest point with the PS3 began with the infamous $599 announcement at E3 2006. But then PlayStation made a roaring comeback at E3 2013 when they were once again able to one-up the competition by announcing the PS4 would be $100 cheaper than the Xbox One. That whole PlayStation conference in 2013 is so iconic, and I feel it is a major reason why Sony was able to take back control of the console market and never look back since. I'm not saying this to gloat about PlayStation's success, but I'm trying to paint a picture for how important E3 could be, and that's why the sudden downfall hurts so much. Looking back now, the first initial sign that something may be wrong with the E3 model came from Nintendo in 2013. It was in 2013 that Nintendo announced they would no longer be doing traditional E3 press conferences. Instead, they would just upload an E3 Nintendo Direct. Nintendo Directs had become increasingly popular, and it was a much cheaper and easier alternative, so it wasn't all too surprising. Nintendo would still release the Direct within the typical E3 week, and would still have a big presence on the show floor. So although it was disappointing to see Nintendo move away from press conferences, it wasn't seen as that big of an issue for E3 at the time. Over the next several years, more changes would come. Despite continuing with the traditional press conferences, Microsoft and EA started setting up their own events close to E3 instead of being on the traditional show floor. It seemed like these companies were beginning to sour on the E3 formula, but were trying to compromise by not pulling out completely. But then everything changed. The biggest blow came in 2019 when Sony pulled out of E3 altogether. This meant PlayStation, the market leader at the time, would not have a press conference, would not be present on the E3 show floor, and would not even be at a nearby location during E3 week. Sony had come to the same conclusion that Nintendo had all the way back in 2013. The major press conference style really just wasn't worth it anymore. Why spend millions of dollars on a show with extreme risk of something going wrong when you can just edit together a Nintendo Direct or a PlayStation Showcase and call it a day? You still get the same amount of viewers and press as the giant stage show would get without any of the risk involved. From a purely business standpoint, I can understand why Nintendo and PlayStation decided to do this. Although I've always felt watching a Nintendo Direct or a PlayStation Showcase just can't match the energy of a press conference, at the end of the day it still gets the job done. Despite Sony and Nintendo stopping their press conferences, the other companies seemed committed to the traditional E3 model, that is, until 2020. Like so many things in our world, E3 was changed forever by the pandemic. The few companies who had still committed to the in-person press conference formula were forced to switch to the digital-only version, and they've never really gone back. The pandemic also meant E3 couldn't have their typical in-person event, which was the primary way they made their money. E3 2021 suffered a similar fate due to the pandemic and was also canceled. E3 canceling their 2020 and 2021 events certainly hurt them, but they really had no choice. The big shock came the next year when E3 2022 was also canceled. E3 2022 was already planned to be a primarily digital event, so the fact that even that was canceled was a very bad sign. Despite this, E3 did claim they would be back in 2023, however, we all knew what was going to happen. And in March 2023, E3 2023 was also canceled. And by this point, basically everything was back to being open as normal, so the pandemic could no longer really be used as an excuse. The reality was, all the major companies were just no longer interested in working with E3. They would all just rather do their own things now. It was pretty sad watching E3 from 2020 to 2023. Every year they claimed they would be back, and every year they would hit us with the same cancellation announcement. It felt like they couldn't accept that E3 was not going to be viable anymore. Funnily enough, I had been planning to make a video about E3 back in December, with the conclusion being that they needed to bite the bullet and cancel the event for good, instead of dragging it along like this. Well, ironically, that's exactly what they did before I could even finish this script, because on December 12th, 2023, the ESA officially announced that E3 was dead and would not be coming back. It was kind of a bittersweet announcement. I say that because E3 has essentially already been dead for 4 years, they just hadn't made it official. And this announcement would at least allow E3 to rest, instead of getting our hopes up for a potential return every year. At the same time though, it did sting to see that it's officially really never coming back. So many of my fondest gaming memories come from E3. It was truly Christmas in June for gamers, and we will never get to experience anything like it again. Nintendo Directs are cool, PlayStation showcases get me excited. I like what Jeff Keighley does with Summer Games Fest, which is really the only E3 alternative we have left. While I do appreciate these alternatives for trying to keep the spirit of E3 alive, the truth is, it will just never be the same. So there you have it. That's the history of E3, from its first creation to its immediate growth to its unfortunate demise. When I look back at E3's history, it's clear to see where things went wrong. A lot of people seem to think the pandemic in 2020 was the only reason E3 started to flounder, but we can see the seeds of that were planted as far back as 2013. With the dominance of social media, there really is no reason to have intricate press conferences and giant show floors to show off games when a simple trailer can get uploaded to YouTube and get viewed hundreds of millions of times. With that in mind, I completely understand why gaming companies moved away from E3. The strategy of making simple digital showcases instead of a press conference is significantly cheaper and has far less risk. Not to mention, this allows the studios to make the announcements when they are ready, instead of forcing things too early in order to have a good showing at E3 every year in June. This also means companies no longer have to compete with each other. For example, Xbox can hold a digital showcase whenever they want to, and by doing it at a time when nothing else is happening in gaming, they can get all the press. With the E3 model, they would have to share that press with Sony and Nintendo. So yeah, moving away from the E3 model allows these companies to save money, have far less risk, and not have to worry about as much competition. So with that in mind, it makes all the sense in the world for these companies to no longer work with E3, but that doesn't make it hurt any less. I will never forget the feelings I had watching E3, and I truly hope that one day I can feel something similar.